Welcome back to the series. Today, we're stepping right into the clinical environment to tackle a crucial piece of the vestibular rehab puzzle, the definitive balance assessment battery. Look, if you treat balance and gait dysfunction, you already know how incredibly complex it can be to figure out exactly what's driving a patient's instability. So today, we're going to break down the specific, objective tools you need to capture that data.
This episode is based on the literature review, Balance and Gait Rehabilitation, Evidence-Based Practice, Sensory Integration, Assessment, and Progressive Exercise, published by Australian Dizziness Clinics, available at australiandizzinessclinics.com.
Here is our clinical roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The baseline imperative. 2. The core battery and thresholds. 3. The tug and cognitive motor interference. 4. Berg and SAOT limitations. And 5. The 6-week retest.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the baseline imperative. I want you to really listen to this foundational principle. You cannot prescribe what you have not measured. A balance program without baseline numbers is a hope, not a plan. We simply can't just hand out generic exercises anymore. Without rock-solid, objective baseline numbers, you can't prove a deficit even exists, you can't tailor your prescription, and you certainly can't prove your program actually worked when that patient comes back. These numbers are the absolute foundation of defensible clinical outcomes.
Moving on to Section 2, the core battery and thresholds. Okay, there are 4 essential tools to make up our complete assessment battery. We've got the Mini-BESTest, the functional gait assessment, the ABC scale, and the timed up and go. When you document these 4 specific metrics together, you capture a beautiful 360-degree view of your patient's static balance, dynamic gait, subjective confidence, and their functional mobility. So let's break down these structural differences of those first 3 tools. The Mini-BESTest looks at 4 distinct subsystems of balance with a maximum score of 28. Then we have the Functional Gait Assessment, or FGA, which is made up of 10 dynamic items for a max score of 30. What's absolutely vital about the FGA is that it samples real-world vestibular challenges, things like walking with head turns or walking with a narrow base of support. And finally, the ABC scale gives us 16 subjective items, measuring a patient's confidence out of 100%.
19. Punch this number into your memory. This is your first critical threshold. If your patient scores under 19 out of 28 on the Mini-BESTest, they are specifically flagged as a serious falls risk. It indicates that their dynamic balance and postural transitions are severely compromised.
Next up, we have 22. This is the magic threshold for the FGA. A score under 22 out of 30 is a major red flag for a vestibular-specific falls risk. Think about it. A patient might walk perfectly fine in a straight line, but the FGA reveals those underlying vestibular deficits the absolute second you ask them to turn their head or step over an obstacle.
And we definitely can't ignore the psychological side of things. 67%. If a patient scores under 67% on the ABC scale, it is a massive predictor that they're developing avoidance behaviors. They lose confidence, they start restricting their daily activities, and ironically, they actually elevate their fall risk because of physical deconditioning.
All right, Section 3, tug and cognitive motor interference.
The timed up and go, or the standard tug, is just beautifully simple. The motor procedure is exactly 4 steps. Sit to stand, walk 3 meters, turn around, and return to sitting. It perfectly visualizes the absolute baseline physical requirement a person needs for functional independent mobility.
Now, if that standard TUG takes your patient over 13.5 seconds, that is our 4th major falls risk threshold. It essentially shows a fundamental lack of functional mobility and speed. But here's where it gets really interesting. We can take this a step further to reveal even more about what's happening in the vestibular system. Let's talk about the cognitive motor interference index. You see, a healthy vestibular system largely automates balance, which leaves your brain free to think about other things. But vestibular hypofunction forces the patient to use active, conscious cognitive attention just to stay upright. We expose this by doing a dual-task tug, basically having them walk the tug while counting backwards. The time difference between their standard tug and their dual-task tug is the interference index. If their walking speed absolutely plummets when they have to think and walk at the same time, it brilliantly exposes a hidden but very high risk for real-world falls.
Section 4, Berg and SOT limitations.
Now you might be wondering, what about other tools?
Well, while the Berg Balance Scale is excellent for older adults or folks with severe impairments, it has a massive ceiling effect for higher functioning vestibular patients. They might score perfectly on the Berg, but still feel completely dizzy and off balance in the real world. On the completely opposite end of the spectrum is the Sensory Organization Test, or SOT. This is the computerized gold standard for isolating the vestibular system. But let's be real, it requires highly expensive dynamic posturography platforms that just aren't available in most clinics. So our 4-tool battery sits right in the practical sweet spot. It's challenging enough to avoid those ceiling effects, but it requires minimal equipment to actually run.
Finally, Section 5, the 6-week retest.
Here is the mandatory action plan I want you to take away from this explainer today. You must document all 4 tools, the Mini-BESTest, FGA, ADC, and TUG, at Session 1. After that, you execute your targeted progressive program, but crucially, you bring them back at week 6 to retest. This allows you to objectively track the minimal clinically important difference, or MCID. This is exactly how you prove with defensible, hard data that your intervention actually worked and genuinely improved their physiological function.
So, now that you've measured the baseline and established your expected outcomes, what exactly do you prescribe? In Part 3 of this explainer series, we are going to cover progressive exercise prescription. We'll show you exactly how to manipulate sensory weighting, implement dual-task training, and progress patients across different terrains. You definitely won't want to miss it.
Before you step into your next clinical session, I want you to ask yourself, without these baseline numbers, are you truly rehabilitating, or are you kind of just guessing? For additional resources, including the full literature review, the clinical cheat sheet, audio overviews, and the rest of this video series, visit AustralianDizzinessClinics.com. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a rating to support the series.